A woman is on her hands and knees in absolute darkness, more than 200 meters from the nearest daylight, and she cannot see her own fingers in front of her face. She is carrying a small stone lamp filled with animal fat, and its flame is the only light that has ever existed in this particular stretch of rock. The passage ahead narrows until her shoulders touch both walls at once. Somewhere behind her, the way out has already disappeared into the same blackness that surrounds her now. She keeps moving forward, into a part of the earth that sunlight has never reached and never will. She is not lost. She is not trapped. She is not running from anything. She chose this. And when she finally reaches the chamber she is looking for, she will kneel on a cold stone floor, mix red and black pigment in the hollow of her palm, and paint a bison on a wall that no casual visitor will ever see by accident. She will not sign her work. She will not explain it to anyone who was not already there with her. Then she will leave the way she came, back through the dark, back into daylight, back into an ordinary life of hunting, gathering, raising children, and growing old. The painting will remain behind her, alone in the dark, for longer than anyone in her lifetime could imagine. Tens of thousands of years later, researchers in flame-retardant suits and headlamps followed narrow beams of light through the same stone corridors and found her work still there. The bison had not faded. The lines had not blurred. In some caves, the black outline of a horse's mane still carried the faint sheen of charcoal applied in a single, unbroken movement of the hand, as if the painter had only just stepped back to look at it. In other chambers, researchers found the pigment cakes people had ground and mixed thousands of years before, sitting exactly where the artists had set them down. This did not happen once, in one cave, by one unusual person. Across a stretch of time longer than the entire span of recorded history, in caves scattered across what is now France and Spain, and in some cases far beyond, people did the same extraordinary thing again and again. They gathered pigment. They prepared fuel for fire. They planned a journey into total darkness that would take real physical effort and real physical risk. And they used all of that effort not to build a shelter, not to store food, not to solve an obvious problem of daily survival, but to create images of animals in places where almost no living person would ever casually see them. Consider what that effort actually meant in the ordinary terms of an Ice Age life. A single day spent traveling underground, mixing paint, and returning to daylight was a day not spent hunting, not spent gathering food, not spent resting, not spent caring directly for children who depended on the group's constant attention for survival. In a world where every calorie mattered and every hour of daylight was genuinely scarce during much of the year, choosing to spend that time crawling through freezing stone passages to paint an animal no one else might ever see was not a small decision. It came at a real measurable cost, paid willingly, over and over, by people whose margin for error in daily survival was already thin. That is the real puzzle. It is not simply that people made cave art. Human beings have painted, carved, and marked surfaces for a very long time, in open rock shelters, on cliff faces, on portable objects carried from camp to camp. Deep cave painting is a different kind of behavior entirely. It required people to leave the world of daylight, food, warmth, and other people, and travel into cramped, freezing, pitch-black passages where a single fall or a single extinguished lamp could mean death. Then, having reached a chamber that might never be seen again by living eyes, they painted with extraordinary skill, using techniques that still challenge modern artists to reproduce. Why would anyone spend that effort on an image meant to be hidden from daylight, hidden from casual view, hidden from almost everyone? For more than a century, since the first disbelieving scientists stood in front of painted bison in northern Spain and refused to accept that ancient humans could have made them, Researchers have tried to answer that question. The honest answer is that no single explanation fully closes the case. But the physical evidence left behind by the painters themselves, the pigments they mixed, the lamps they carried, the footprints they left in cave floors that had not been disturbed since the Ice Age, the sounds their chambers were built to carry, and the images they chose to paint again and again across thousands of years, together tell a story about what people were willing to risk and why. This is the story of who went into the dark, what they carried with them, and what the evidence left behind is finally able to tell us about why they went at all. Chapter 1. The Discovery Scientists Refuse to Believe. In the autumn of 1879, a landowner named Marcelino Sanz de Sautuola was digging through the floor of a cave called Altamira in the hills above the northern coast of Spain, searching for stone tools and animal bones. He had visited the cave before and found nothing remarkable on the walls. On this visit, his 8-year-old daughter Maria wandered a short distance ahead of him with a lamp into a low side chamber he had barely bothered to examine, and looked up at the ceiling. What she saw stopped her. Painted across the low stone roof in red and black was a herd of bison, some standing, some crouched, some appearing to twist their bodies in motion, rendered with a confidence and anatomical accuracy that had no obvious parallel anywhere in the archaeology of the time. Sautuola believed, correctly, that he had found something extraordinary. He published his findings and argued that the paintings belonged to the same ancient period as the stone tools found on the cave floor, a period that predated writing, farming, and settled village life by many thousands of years. The response from the leading prehistorians of the day was not curiosity, it was open scorn. Later reassessments of the Altamira controversy have also highlighted an uncomfortable pattern worth naming directly. National and institutional rivalry played a role in how quickly the paintings were dismissed. Sautuola was a provincial landowner, not a credentialed member of the Parisian scientific establishment that dominated prehistoric archaeology at the time, and several later historians of science have argued that this imbalance of professional standing made it easier for established specialists to dismiss his claim without the same scrutiny they might have applied to a finding presented by one of their own colleagues. That dynamic, evidence being judged partly on the standing of the person presenting it, rather than purely on its own merits, is a caution that extends well beyond this single case, and it is part of why modern archaeological practice places such heavy emphasis on independent replication and open publication of raw data, rather than relying on the reputation of any individual researcher. At a major archaeological conference in Lisbon in 1880, French specialists dismissed the paintings as a fraud, suggesting that Sautuola had hired a contemporary artist to paint them, possibly using paints that could not have survived from deep antiquity. One prominent researcher accused him directly of fabrication. Sautuola spent the final years of his life defending a discovery that the scientific establishment of his era refused to take seriously. It is worth pausing on how severe the initial rejection actually was, because it shapes how carefully this documentary treats every claim that follows. Sautuola was not merely ignored, he was accused, in print and at public conferences, of deliberate deception, an accusation that attacked his personal integrity as much as his archaeological conclusions. He had, in fact, invited a respected geologist to examine the cave with him before publishing, and had taken reasonable steps by the standards of his era to document the find responsibly. None of that was enough to protect his reputation while he was alive to defend it. The doubt was not simply stubbornness. It reflected a genuine problem in how 19th century scholars understood the deep human past. The prevailing image of Ice Age humans shaped by decades of finding crude stone tools and fragmentary bones, was of people who were barely surviving, mentally simple, and incapable of complex symbolic thought. A painted ceiling that displayed a mastery of anatomy, movement, and shading that would not look out of place beside the work of trained 19th-century artists did not fit that picture. Rather than revise the picture, the specialists of the time revised the evidence out of existence, at least in their own minds. Sautuola died in 1888 without seeing his discovery accepted. Vindication came slowly and from an unexpected direction. In the years that followed, other painted caves began to surface across southern France, including La Mouth in 1895 and Les Combarelles and Font de Gaume in 1901, each containing artwork buried beneath layers of undisturbed sediment that could be shown, through careful excavation, to predate the modern era by a wide margin. The French prehistorian Émile Cartaillac, who had been one of the most vocal critics of the Altamira paintings, visited Font de Gaume in 1901, examined the stratified deposits sealing the art beneath layers that had clearly not been touched since deep antiquity, and reached a conclusion that took real intellectual honesty to state publicly. In 1902, he published an article titled, in French, La grotte d'Altamira, Espagne, mea culpa d'un sceptique. He had been wrong. Altamira was genuine. Cartaillac used his own reversal to argue that the entire discipline needed to rethink what Ice Age humans had been capable of. That admission opened a new chapter in how researchers approached the deep past, but it also created a lasting caution that still shapes the field today. Investigators learned, from painful experience, that extraordinary claims about ancient behavior demand extraordinary evidence, verified independently, before they can be trusted. That caution matters directly for the story of why people painted deep inside caves, because every explanation offered since Cartaillac's reversal has had to survive the same kind of scrutiny that Sautuola's discovery originally failed to receive. Confident theories about ritual, religion, hunting magic, or shamanic trance have circulated for more than a century, and each one has had to be tested against physical evidence rather than accepted because it sounds plausible. The caves themselves, once excavation methods improved, began to reveal something that went well beyond the paintings on their walls. Underneath the images, cave floors preserved a kind of frozen moment: charcoal from burned-out torches, fragments of stone lamps, footprints pressed into soft clay that had never been disturbed by animals, weather, or later human visitors. Because deep cave interiors maintain a remarkably stable temperature and humidity, protected from rain, wind, and sunlight, this material survived in a way that open-air sites rarely allow. A campsite exposed to the elements for 20,000 years loses almost everything organic. A sealed cave chamber can preserve a footprint as if it were pressed into the clay yesterday. This is what makes deep cave art different from almost every other category of prehistoric evidence available to researchers. Most archaeology reconstructs behavior indirectly, from broken tools, scattered bones, and the faint chemical traces left in ancient soil. Painted caves, by contrast, preserve the actual physical act of creation, sealed in place, along with a wide range of related evidence documenting exactly how the painters got there, what they carried, and in some cases, how many of them were present, whether they were adults or children, and how long they stayed. Chauvet's own discovery, in December 1994, was made under conditions that allowed for a level of scientific documentation the original 1940 discovery of Lascaux never received. The three cave explorers who first entered Chauvet, Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire, recognized immediately what they had found and moved quickly to secure the site, and involve professional researchers, rather than allowing informal, uncontrolled visitation of the kind that had already begun to damage the painted surfaces at Lascaux before proper protective measures were established there. That difference in how the two discoveries were handled is a large part of why Chauvet's floor still preserves footprints, torch wipe marks, and animal bones essentially undisturbed since the Ice Age, giving researchers a level of physical detail about the original visitors that even Lascaux, despite its own artistic importance, cannot fully match. By the early 20th century, the outline of a genuine mystery had taken shape, distinct from the earlier controversy over fraud. Nobody seriously doubted anymore that Ice Age humans had created these images. The new question was harder to answer with confidence. Why had they gone to such extreme lengths, physically and logistically, to place these images in locations that were, by any ordinary standard, almost impossible to see? A campfire scene painted at the mouth of a cave, in reach of daylight, could plausibly serve as decoration, as a marker for other travelers, or as a backdrop to daily life. A bison painted 800 meters into total darkness, past narrow passages that require crawling on hands and knees, cannot serve any of those obvious functions. Whoever painted it clearly did not intend for it to be seen casually, or perhaps even seen very often at all. The controversy over authenticity did not fully disappear with Cartel Hack's public reversal in 1902. It resurfaced periodically for decades afterward, each time a new painted cave came to light. When 4 teenagers stumbled into the cave that would become known as Lascaux in September 1940, following their dog into a hole left by a fallen tree, the discovery was greeted with more excitement than doubt, a sign of how far the field had come in 60 years. But even then, specialists insisted on careful stratigraphic verification, checking that the sediment layers sealing the cave floor beneath the paintings had genuinely remained undisturbed since deep antiquity, before allowing the site to be accepted into the scientific record. That same caution applied again in 1991, when a diver named Henri Cosquer discovered a painted cave entrance more than 100 meters underwater off the coast of Marseille, its lower passages flooded by rising sea levels since the end of the Ice Age. Researchers had to establish through careful underwater excavation and dating that the paintings inside genuinely predated the flooding and had not been placed there by a hoaxer exploiting the site's dramatic inaccessibility. They had. That same standard continues to shape how researchers approach new claims today, and it explains why this documentary has repeatedly paused, throughout the chapters that follow, to distinguish between what physical evidence establishes with confidence and what remains genuinely contested or uncertain among specialists. A field that once dismissed a genuine discovery because it did not match existing assumptions about ancient human capability has, in the century and a half since, built a working culture that treats confident overreach as a serious professional failure, whether that overreach comes from a skeptic too quick to dismiss real evidence or from an enthusiast too quick to claim more certainty than the evidence actually supports. Both mistakes carry the same underlying lesson learned from Sautuola's case. The deep human past deserves to be investigated on the strength of what can actually be verified, not on the strength of what researchers, in any given era, already expect to find there. This pattern, extraordinary claim followed by rigorous, sometimes multi-year verification, is not a flaw in how the field operates. It is the reason that findings accepted today about painted caves carry real scientific weight, rather than resting on the kind of uncorroborated assertion that doomed Sautuola's reputation during his own lifetime. Every dating result, every claim about technique, and every proposed explanation for why the paintings were made has had to survive scrutiny of the kind that first destroyed, and then eventually vindicated, the discovery at Altamira. That distinction between art made in daylight and art made in permanent darkness became the foundation for everything that followed in the study of Ice Age cave painting. It is the reason later researchers stopped asking simply, "Why did people make cave art?" and began asking a much more specific and much harder question: what made the darkness itself worth the risk? Answering that question required following the physical evidence left by the painters step by step, starting with the most basic problem any of them had to solve before a single brushstroke could be applied. They needed to find their way into the dark, and they needed a way to see once they got there. Chapter 2: The footprints that never left in a cave called Tuc de Doubert in the foothills of the French Pyrenees. A passage leads far back into the mountain, past painted panels, past narrow crawl spaces, into a chamber where two clay bisons stand, modelled in relief against a rock, leaning against a natural boulder as though resting. The sculptures are extraordinary in themselves, shaped by hand from wet clay roughly 15,000 years ago. But it is the floor around them that gives the clearest window into who made the journey to reach them. Pressed into the soft clay of the chamber floor are dozens of human footprints, preserved because the chamber has remained sealed and undisturbed since the day they were made. Analysis of the footprints based on size, arch, and stride length suggests that a group of children and adolescents walked through this space, some of them barefoot, on a floor 2/3 of a mile from the cave entrance. This single detail changes the shape of the mystery. A painted cave is not necessarily the work of one isolated specialist creeping into the dark alone. In many cases, it was the destination of a group, including young people, who made the same demanding journey together. Footprint evidence from other caves tells similar stories. At the cave of Fontenay, also in the French Pyrenees, a set of footprints belonging to a child roughly 8 to 10 years old runs alongside adult footprints deep into the cave system, in a passage far from any painted panel, suggesting the child was simply part of the group making the trip, not necessarily there to see or make art at all. At the cave of Niaux, footprints have been found in a chamber called the Salon Noir, near some of the most elaborate painted panels in the entire system, left by people whose feet ranged from small children to full-grown adults. None of this evidence identifies a single named individual. No inscription survives to tell us who these people were, what they were called, or what they believed as they walked. What survives is something narrower but still remarkably informative, a direct physical trace of movement, showing where people stepped, how they were arranged relative to each other, whether they walked confidently or cautiously, and in some documented cases, whether they were carrying something. At the cave of Chauvet, in the Ardèche region of southern France, researchers identified a set of footprints alongside charcoal marks on the cave wall that appear to have been made by rubbing a torch against the rock, a practical action to knock off burned material and brighten the flame. The footprints beside these torch marks belong to a single individual, and analysis of stride and foot shape has led some researchers to suggest they may have belonged to a child or young adolescent, walking alone through a section of the cave far from the entrance. That possibility, that some of the people making these journeys into total darkness were young, deserves to be treated with the same caution that this documentary applies to every other claim about the deep past. Footprint analysis is not perfect. Estimating age from a footprint impressed in clay thousands of years ago is not the same as measuring a living foot, and researchers who specialize in this kind of analysis are careful to describe their conclusions as estimates with a real margin of error. What can be said with more confidence is that the group of people entering these caves was not limited to a narrow category of specialist adults. Footprints of varying sizes in varying combinations appear across many painted cave systems, suggesting these were journeys undertaken by extended social groups rather than solitary priests or shamans working in total isolation, at least on some occasions. The physical demands of the journey itself help explain why the presence of children in this evidence is so striking. Reaching the painted chambers at Tuc d'Audubert, Niaux, or the deepest sections of Chauvet required navigating passages that, in places, narrow to less than a meter in height, forcing an adult to crawl on hands and knees while pushing equipment ahead. Some passages required wading through cold groundwater, others crossed sections with steep drops, where a fall in total darkness could cause serious injury with no possibility of rapid rescue. Modern cave researchers, equipped with rope, headlamps, and emergency communication, still treat these passages with serious caution. People walking by the light of a single animal fat lamp, wearing simple leather footwear or none at all, were accepting a level of physical risk that had no equivalent in an ordinary day of hunting or gathering on the open landscape above. Why accept that risk, and why bring children along on some of these expeditions? One responsible interpretation, grounded directly in the footprint evidence rather than speculation about belief systems, is that the deep cave journey functioned, at least in part, as a shared experience passed between generations. A skill, a location, a set of images maintained and revisited over time is far more likely to survive across generations if young people are present to witness it directly rather than hear about it secondhand. This does not require assuming any specific religious motive. It requires only that the people who used these caves valued continuity, wanted the next generation to know the route, the danger points, and perhaps the meaning attached to particular images, and were willing to accept real physical risk to make that transmission happen in person rather than through description alone. The footprint evidence also complicates a simpler, more dramatic image that has circulated in popular accounts of cave art for decades. The lone shaman, disappearing alone into the underworld to commune with spirits and returning with visions painted on stone. That image may capture something true about certain individual expeditions, particularly the single set of footprints recorded beside torch-charring marks deep inside Chauvet. But it cannot account for the groups of mixed-age footprints found in other chambers, walking together toward destinations that combined painted panels, sculpted clay figures, and in some documented cases, no visible art at all, simply a chamber that had been visited and then left undisturbed. The physical trace left in the clay suggests a range of different journeys, made for a range of different reasons by different combinations of people, rather than a single ritual practice performed identically every time. Footprint evidence of this kind is not limited to France. At Basura Cave, in the Liguria region of northern Italy, researchers documented a set of footprints belonging to at least 3 individuals, likely 2 adolescents and 1 younger child, who walked barefoot through wet clay deep inside the cave, roughly 14,000 years ago, apparently deliberately avoiding easier, drier routes in favor of a path that took them close to a natural clay formation, where researchers also found evidence that fingers had been dragged through the soft surface, possibly during the same visit. This site, though it does not contain elaborate painted panels comparable to Chauvet or Lascaux, offers some of the clearest surviving evidence anywhere of young people moving deliberately through a deep cave system, their footprints preserved by the same rare combination of stable temperature, humidity, and total isolation from erosion that has protected footprint evidence at the French sites. The specific methodology used to estimate age and identity from an ancient footprint relies on comparison against large modern reference datasets, correlating foot length, width, and arch structure against known measurements from people of documented age across childhood and adolescent development. Because bone growth and foot proportions follow reasonably well-documented patterns across human populations, Researchers can generally distinguish a young child's footprint from an adolescent's or an adult's with a fair degree of confidence, though pinning down a precise age within a narrow range remains genuinely difficult, and specialists publishing this kind of analysis routinely report their conclusions as estimated ranges rather than exact figures, a practice consistent with the broader evidentiary caution this documentary has applied throughout. Careful measurement of the spacing and depth of footprints at several of these sites has allowed researchers to draw further, cautious conclusions about how these groups moved. Even, confident stride patterns, without the scuffing or irregular spacing associated with stumbling or hesitation, suggest that at least some of these journeys were made by people moving with familiarity and purpose rather than nervous uncertainty, further supporting the idea that many of these expeditions followed routes that had already been learned and tested rather than explored for the first time. What all of these journeys share, regardless of who made them or why, is the basic fact that they required light. No footprint, however well preserved, tells its own story about the flame that guided the person who left it. That evidence exists separately, scattered across cave floors in the form of stone lamps, charcoal deposits, and torchwipe marks on cave walls, and it turns out to answer a question just as important as who walked into the dark. How did they see once they got there, and how long could they stay? Chapter 3. The Fire They Had to Carry. A cave interior beyond the reach of the entrance is one of the darkest environments a human being can enter. It is darker than a moonless night in open country, because open country still carries faint starlight, faint reflected light from clouds or distant horizons. A deep cave passage receives none of that. Researchers who have studied these environments describe the darkness as total, meaning the human eye receives no usable light at all, regardless of how long it adapts. Anyone entering that environment without a working source of fire is, in practical terms, blind. Every single act performed inside a painted cave, from walking the passage safely to mixing pigment to applying it accurately to a wall, depended entirely on a flame that had to be created, carried, protected, and maintained for as long as the visit lasted. The physical evidence for how this was managed survives in three main forms: burned wood and charcoal left over from portable torches, stone lamps designed to hold burning fat, and marks left directly on cave walls where torches were struck or rubbed to knock off spent material and refresh the flame. Each form of evidence answers a slightly different question about the logistics of working in total darkness. Torches, made from resinous wood such as pine, produced a strong but relatively short-lived flame and required frequent maintenance. Researchers studying the wall surfaces of painted caves have identified thousands of individual torchwipe marks, streaks of charcoal residue left where a person struck a burning torch against the rock to knock off ash and reignite the flame. At Chauvet, more than 400 such marks have been documented and mapped throughout the cave system, and researchers have used them to reconstruct likely routes taken by visitors moving between chambers. The distribution of these marks shows that visitors did not wander randomly. They followed specific paths, refreshing their torches at broadly similar points along the route each time, suggesting a level of familiarity with the cave's layout that could only have developed through repeated visits, likely guided by people who already knew the way. Stone lamps offer a different kind of evidence, because unlike a torch, a lamp is a manufactured object, deliberately shaped, that can survive intact on a cave floor for tens of thousands of years. More than 100 stone lamps have been recovered from painted cave sites across France and Spain, most of them simple, shallow depressions carved or naturally formed in a piece of limestone or sandstone, designed to hold a small pool of rendered animal fat, with a wick made from plant fibre or juniper bark laid across the rim. Chemical residue analysis performed on lamps recovered from Lascaux and other sites has identified traces consistent with animal fat, most likely from species such as reindeer, whose fat renders at a low enough temperature to burn steadily and cleanly, producing far less smoke than burning wood alone. The specific plant materials used for wicks also required deliberate selection. Juniper bark, documented at several sites through microscopic residue analysis, burns slowly and produces a steady flame well suited to sustained lamp use. And juniper grew in the cold, semi-arid landscape surrounding many of these cave systems during the Ice Age, meaning it was locally available rather than requiring long-distance transport. Choosing a wick material that burned cleanly and steadily, rather than simply using whatever fibrous plant matter happened to be closest at hand, is a further small but telling sign of accumulated, tested practical knowledge, the kind of detail that only becomes obvious through repeated trial across many actual visits rather than a single improvised attempt. Determining exactly which animal species supplied the fat used in a given lamp requires laboratory analysis capable of detecting and comparing lipid residues at a molecular level, a technique that has only become reliable and widely applied in Paleolithic archaeology in recent decades. Earlier generations of researchers could identify a stone object as a probable lamp based on its shape alone, a shallow depression clearly designed to hold liquid fuel, but could say little with confidence about what that fuel actually was. Modern residue analysis has closed much of that gap, and the growing body of results consistently points toward herbivore body fat, most often from reindeer or similar cold-adapted species, as the dominant fuel source across the sites tested so far. The choice of fuel matters more than it might first appear. A torch made from resinous pine burns brightly but produces heavy smoke, which in the confined, poorly ventilated passages of a cave interior can accumulate to dangerous levels over an extended visit. A rendered fat lamp, by contrast, burns with a smaller, steadier flame and produces significantly less smoke, at the cost of providing less overall light. The presence of both technologies at many sites suggests that Ice Age visitors understood this trade-off and matched their equipment to the task at hand. Torches for rapid movement through passages, where brightness and portability mattered more than smoke, and lamps for extended, stationary work, such as detailed painting, where a steady, low flame that did not choke the air was more valuable than raw brightness. Experimental archaeology has added a further layer of insight to this picture. Researchers have reconstructed replica stone lamps using the same basic design recovered from cave floors, filled them with rendered animal fat, and tested how long they burn, how much light they produce, and how much smoke accumulates in an enclosed space. These experiments consistently show that a single small lamp of this design can burn for approximately 1 hour on a modest amount of fuel, producing a warm, steady light adequate for detailed work at close range, though far dimmer than modern artificial lighting. Painting a complex panel, such as the horse frieze at Chauvet's horse panel or the Great Hall of Bulls at Lascaux, would have required either an extended supply of fuel carried into the cave or multiple separate visits spread across time, each one lit and equipped from the surface. This detail carries real weight for understanding the scale of commitment involved. A single visit into a deep cave chamber was not a brief errand. It required advanced preparation, rendering fat from a hunted animal, shaping a lamp or gathering torch wood, likely testing the fuel supply before setting out, and calculating how much light would be needed for the planned work, relative to how much could realistically be carried. Running out of fuel deep inside a cave system, far from any natural light source, was not a minor inconvenience. It represented a genuine survival emergency, in an environment where disorientation in total darkness could easily prove fatal. Beyond torches and lamps, researchers have also identified evidence at several sites for a third, complementary lighting strategy. Small, controlled hearth fires built directly on cave floors at intervals along well-traveled routes, distinct from the portable torches and lamps carried by hand. Charcoal and ash deposits consistent with these stationary fires have been recovered at points within some cave systems that appear to correspond to natural resting points or junctions where a passage branches in more than one direction, suggesting these fixed fires may have served as waypoints, helping travelers orient themselves and rest safely partway through a long underground journey, rather than providing direct light for painting itself. The care taken over fuel management shows up in another piece of physical evidence: the placement of lamps and torch wipe marks relative to the painted panels themselves. At several sites, researchers have found small niches or ledges near major painted panels that appear to have been used to rest a lamp at a stable height and angle, positioned to illuminate the working surface without producing harsh shadows across the artist's hand. This is not evidence of casual improvisation. It reflects planning, spatial memory, and likely repeated practice, refined over more than one visit, by people who understood the specific lighting needs of the task they intended to perform. One of the most famous individual lamps recovered from any painted cave illustrates this convergence of practical function and deliberate craftsmanship particularly well. A sandstone lamp discovered at Lascaux, shaped with a long handle carved to fit comfortably in a closed hand and decorated with an engraved image of a horse's head along the handle itself, shows that even a purely functional tool, one that would spend most of its working life in total darkness, where its decoration could barely be seen by its own user, was still considered worth the extra effort of careful shaping and engraving. This detail matters because it suggests that the line between a purely practical object and a meaningful one may not have been as sharply drawn in the minds of the people who made it as it is in modern categories of tool versus art. Soot deposits on cave ceilings, a less obvious form of evidence than the lamps and torch wipe marks already discussed, have also given researchers a way to estimate roughly how long individual visits lasted. In sections of cave passage where smoke from torches or lamps accumulated on the low stone ceiling over repeated visits, the thickness and layering of that soot can be sampled and analyzed, sometimes revealing distinct bands corresponding to separate visits, separated by enough time for a thin mineral film to form between them. Where this kind of layered soot analysis has been carried out, it has generally supported the picture already built from other evidence. Individual visits appear to have lasted anywhere from under an hour, consistent with a single lamp's fuel supply, to several hours, in cases where multiple lamps or a supplementary torch supply extended the available working light. Radiocarbon dating of torch charcoal recovered from cave floors has also allowed researchers to test whether visits associated with different painted panels within the same cave happened close together in time or were separated by long gaps, adding a further layer of chronological precision to the picture built from the pigment dating discussed later in this investigation. At several sites, charcoal recovered from the floor immediately beneath a painted panel has returned dates closely matching the pigment dates for the painting above it, supporting the straightforward conclusion that the torch or lamplight documented on the floor was, in fact, the light used to create the specific image found nearby, rather than evidence from an unrelated, later visit. All of this material evidence, torch marks, lamp fragments, fat residue, careful placement near painted panels, converges on the same basic conclusion. The journey into darkness was not a spontaneous act. It required forethought that began well before anyone set foot inside the cave, hunting or acquiring the animal whose fat would fuel the lamp, preparing the wick, gathering or selecting torchwood, and likely testing how long the available fuel would last relative to the planned work. Every painted panel deep inside these caves represents not just the skill of the hand that painted it, but a successful piece of logistics, carried out in an environment that offered no room for improvisation once the flame went out. That same careful preparation extended to the pigments themselves, the actual material that became bison, horses, and lions on the cave wall. Like the fuel for the lamps, the paint did not simply appear at the artist's fingertips. It had to be found, processed, and carried, often from sources located well outside the cave, in a supply chain that researchers have only recently begun to reconstruct in detail. Chapter 4. The chemistry they carried in their hands. The colors that survive on cave walls today, deep red, brown, black, and occasionally yellow, come from a small number of naturally occurring minerals that Ice Age people learned to identify, extract, and process with real technical sophistication. Red and yellow pigments came primarily from ochre, an iron-rich mineral found in varying shades depending on its exact chemical composition and, in some cases, the temperature at which it was heated. Black pigment came primarily from manganese oxide, a different mineral entirely, or from charcoal produced by controlled burning. None of these materials occurs in a form ready to use straight out of the ground. Each one required a sequence of deliberate processing steps before it could function as paint capable of adhering to a damp limestone wall and surviving for tens of thousands of years. Researchers analyzing pigment samples from painted caves have used techniques such as X-ray diffraction and scanning electron microscopy to identify the precise mineral composition of the paint and, in some cases, to trace it back toward likely source locations. This work has produced a striking finding. The raw material used for painting was not always available near the cave entrance. At several sites, geochemical analysis suggests that pigment sources lay several kilometers away, meaning that ochre or manganese had to be located, extracted, and transported to the cave before any painting could begin. This adds another layer of logistics on top of the fuel management already required for lighting the passage, and it suggests that a painting expedition may have been preceded by a separate expedition focused purely on gathering raw material. Once transported to the cave, or possibly processed nearby before the underground journey began, pigment required physical preparation. Manganese oxide and ochre are naturally hard, often occurring as solid nodules or crusts that must be ground into a fine powder before they can be mixed into usable paint. Archaeologists have recovered grinding stones and pigment processing tools from cave floors and nearby occupation sites, some retaining a visible residue of red or black powder in the grooves worn into their surface by repeated use. At the cave of La Gama, in northern Spain, excavators found small clusters of ground pigment, together with the tools used to process it, situated close to painted panels, suggesting that at least some paint preparation happened on site, close to where it would be applied, rather than being carried in already mixed. Heat treatment adds a further layer of technical sophistication documented at some sites. Researchers studying certain ochre samples have found evidence that the raw mineral was deliberately heated before use, a process that can shift its natural color from a duller yellow-brown toward a more vivid red, through a chemical transformation in the iron oxide structure of the mineral itself. Identifying this kind of deliberate heat treatment requires laboratory analysis capable of detecting the specific crystalline changes that heating produces, and where it has been documented, it demonstrates that Ice Age pigment preparation went beyond simple grinding, extending into genuine applied chemistry, refined through observation and repeated practice, aimed at achieving a specific, desired visual result. The powdered mineral alone does not make usable paint. It requires a binding agent, a liquid that allows the powder to be applied smoothly to a rock surface and that helps it adhere once dry. Researchers have proposed several candidate binders based on chemical residue analysis and experimental replication, including water, animal fat, blood, plant saps, and in some cases, naturally occurring calcium-rich water that seeps through limestone caves and can act as a light natural cement once it dries over pigment. The exact binder used likely varied by site, by available materials, and possibly by the specific artistic technique the painter intended to use, whether a hard outline requiring a thick, controlled paste, or a soft, blown application requiring a thinner, more fluid mixture. That second technique, blown application, is documented directly through physical evidence rather than inferred indirectly. At several cave sites, researchers have identified painted areas, particularly the negative hand stencils found throughout Ice Age cave art, that were created by placing a hand against the rock and blowing liquid pigment around it through a tube, likely a hollow bone or a length of reed, leaving a stenciled outline of the hand in the surrounding color. Analysis of the pigment particle size and distribution pattern around these stencils is consistent with a sprayed or blown application, rather than pigment applied with a brush or a finger. This detail matters because it demonstrates that Ice Age painters were not limited to a single technique. They had, at minimum, direct application with a solid tool, a fingertip or a mineral crayon-like block of pigment, and an indirect blown or sprayed technique requiring a separate tool and a specific liquid consistency. The range of techniques extended further still. Researchers studying the animal figures at Chauvet identified evidence of shading applied by rubbing pigment with the palm of the hand or a soft material, producing a smooth gradation from dark to light that gives some of the animal figures a genuinely three-dimensional appearance, using the natural contours of the cave wall to suggest muscle and volume. In several panels, artists appear to have deliberately used a bulge or hollow in the rock surface to represent the shoulder or haunch of an animal, integrating the three-dimensional shape of the cave itself into the two-dimensional image painted across it. This is not the mark of an untrained hand experimenting for the first time. It reflects a deliberate, practiced visual technique, developed and refined enough to be applied confidently under the difficult working conditions of a dim lamp and a cold, damp chamber far underground. Radiocarbon dating of the charcoal-based black pigment used in several panels, most famously at Chauvet, has provided some of the strongest chronological evidence available for how far back this practiced skill extends. Charcoal contains carbon that can be directly dated, unlike mineral pigments such as ochre and manganese, which contain no organic carbon and cannot be dated by the same method. Direct radiocarbon dating of charcoal pigment from Chauvet's animal panels, first carried out by the French dating laboratory under Hélène Valladas in the years following the cave's 1994 discovery, produced results indicating an age of roughly 36,000 years for some of the earliest painted panels, making them, at the time of publication, among the oldest securely dated figurative paintings known anywhere in the world. That result initially provoked skepticism within the field, for reasons connected directly to the caution born from the Altamira controversy nearly a century earlier. Some researchers questioned whether the sophisticated, confident artistic technique visible at Chauvet was consistent with such an early date, given that other securely dated cave art from sites such as Lascaux, roughly 17,000 years old, and Altamira's main polychrome ceiling, roughly 14,000 years old, came from a much later period. If Chauvet's dates were correct, it meant that a fully developed, technically sophisticated painting tradition existed far earlier than previously assumed, with little evidence of a slow, gradual improvement in skill leading up to it. Subsequent dating work, using both radiocarbon analysis on additional pigment and charcoal samples and independent methods applied to cave sediment layers sealing the art in place, has largely confirmed Valadez's original results, and Chauvet's early date is now broadly accepted within the field, though the implications of a fully mature artistic tradition, appearing without an obvious gradual build-up, remain an active subject of discussion among researchers. The technical sophistication documented at Chauvet and the other major European painted caves did not appear from nowhere. Evidence for deliberate pigment processing extends much further back in time, in a different region and a different archaeological context, that this documentary treats as important background rather than a direct part of the same tradition. At Blombos Cave, on the southern coast of South Africa, researchers led by Christopher Henshelwood recovered a toolkit for grinding and mixing ochre, including shells used as mixing containers, dated to roughly 100,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived in Europe at all. That discovery, published in the journal Science in 2011, demonstrates that the underlying technical knowledge required to process mineral pigment into a usable paste, selecting the right raw material, grinding it, and combining it with a liquid binder, was already part of the human technical repertoire long before anyone painted an animal on a European cave wall. This does not mean the Blombos toolkit and the Chauvet paintings represent one continuous, unbroken tradition passed directly from one site to the other. The two are separated by enormous distances and tens of thousands of years, and this documentary makes no claim that a direct link between them has been established. What the Blombos evidence does establish, responsibly, is that the specific technical capacity to prepare mineral pigment as paint was not a sudden, isolated invention unique to Ice Age Europe. It was a capability that appears deep in the broader human story, wherever researchers have looked closely enough to find preserved evidence of it. Within Europe itself, researchers have also traced the specific mineral sources used at individual sites with growing precision. At El Castillo, in northern Spain, geochemical analysis of red ochre pigment has been compared against samples collected from natural ochre deposits in the surrounding landscape, allowing researchers to propose likely source locations for at least some of the material used inside the cave. This kind of sourcing work is painstaking because ochre deposits can vary in chemical signature even within a relatively small region, and because many potential source locations have themselves been altered or destroyed by thousands of years of subsequent erosion, agriculture, and construction. Where sourcing has succeeded, it has generally reinforced the picture already established by other evidence. Pigment was not simply picked up incidentally during an otherwise unrelated errand. It was deliberately sought out, in some cases from specific locations that may have been visited repeatedly over long periods, precisely because their pigment was known, through direct experience passed between people, to produce good paint. What the pigment evidence establishes beyond dispute is the level of deliberate technical knowledge required before a single animal could appear on a cave wall. Someone had to know where to find the right minerals. Someone had to know how to grind them into a workable powder. Someone had to know which binder produced a paste suitable for outlining, and which liquid mixture worked for a blown stencil. And someone had to master the physical technique of applying that mixture confidently, by hand, by tool, or by breath, onto a cold, uneven, often damp rock surface, using only the light of a small flame to guide the work. None of this was improvised on the spot. It was knowledge built, tested, and passed on, almost certainly across more than one generation of painters, long before any particular expedition into the dark began. That transmitted knowledge answers part of the mystery of how deep cave painting was possible. It does not yet answer why people considered it worth the underlying risk. To understand that, the investigation has to follow the physical evidence into the most dangerous part of the journey itself, the narrow, twisting passages that separated the cave entrance from the painted chambers, and ask what kind of commitment it actually took to get a lamp, a supply of pigment, and a human body safely through them. Chapter 5. The passages that almost refused them. At the Cave of Gargas, in the French Pyrenees, a passage leading toward one of the most heavily decorated chambers narrows so severely that an adult must turn sideways and exhale to pass through. At Rouffignac, in the Dordogne region of France, the painted galleries stretch more than a mile into the hillside, far enough that early explorers of the cave, before its prehistoric art was formally recognized in 1956, apparently walked past some of the most significant painted panels without noticing them in the dim light of hand-carried lanterns. At Chauvet, reaching the chamber containing the famous horse panel requires descending a steep slope in near-total darkness, along a route that modern researchers, despite headlamps, safety ropes and detailed maps, still treat with active caution. These are not incidental details of cave geography. They are central to understanding the actual physical cost of deep cave painting, a cost that goes well beyond the logistics of carrying fuel and pigment already discussed. Every meter traveled past the reach of daylight increased the risk of the journey, and the deepest, most elaborately painted chambers in many cave systems are also, consistently, among the hardest to reach. Speleologists, researchers who specialize in the scientific study of caves, have mapped the routes connecting cave entrances to major painted panels at dozens of sites, and have generally found a striking pattern. Painted images cluster disproportionately in locations that required real physical effort and real risk to reach. Narrow crawlways, steep descents, sections requiring travel through standing or flowing water, chambers positioned past physical obstacles that would have demanded specific knowledge of the safe route to avoid injury. Some caves do contain art relatively close to their entrances, in chambers that would have received at least indirect daylight during parts of the day. But the deepest, most extensively decorated chambers, the ones that later became famous worldwide, such as the Hall of Bulls at Lascaux, the Salon Noir at Niaux, and the End Chamber at Chauvet, sit well past the point where any natural light could reach, often requiring 20 minutes to an hour of careful underground travel from the entrance, even with modern equipment. Rouffignac offers a particularly clear illustration of just how deep some of this imagery sits within the earth. The cave's most heavily decorated section, known as the Great Ceiling, lies roughly 1.5 kilometers from the entrance, reachable only after passing through a network of branching passages that would have offered numerous opportunities for a disoriented traveler to become genuinely, dangerously lost without confident prior knowledge of the correct route. That so much elaborate painted imagery exists at such a remote point within the cave system, rather than clustered near the more accessible entrance chambers, reinforces the broader pattern documented across multiple sites. Distance and difficulty were not obstacles Ice Age painters merely tolerated. In many cases, they appear to have actively sought out the deepest reachable chambers for their most significant work. This pattern raises a direct question about intention. If the goal had simply been decoration, marking, or visual display for other people passing through the landscape, painting near a cave entrance, where at least some ambient light would help visibility and where the images might be seen by anyone passing nearby, would have made the task dramatically easier and safer. Instead, across many sites, painters consistently pushed past the easier, more visible locations to work in chambers that offered no such advantage, chambers that could only be reached by people who already knew the route, who carried adequate light and fuel, and who were willing to accept the physical risk involved. That risk was not hypothetical. Injuries sustained deep inside a cave system, far from help, with no way to summon assistance, and no guarantee that anyone on the surface even knew the specific route taken, could easily prove fatal in a way that a similar injury on open ground, near camp, would not. A twisted ankle on a hunting trip is a serious problem. The same injury a mile into a cave system, in total darkness, with a limited fuel supply and a difficult crawl still ahead, is a potentially fatal one. Hypothermia posed a further danger. Deep cave interiors in temperate regions typically maintain a stable temperature well below normal body comfortable levels, often in the range of 10 to 13 degrees Celsius year-round, cold enough to become dangerous during an extended visit, particularly for a person remaining still for a long period while painting a detailed panel. Researchers studying the physical evidence of movement inside these caves, including the torchwipe marks and footprint trails discussed earlier, have found additional signs that painters and their companions took deliberate precautions against these risks. At several sites, torchwipe marks appear at consistent intervals along known routes, suggesting travelers refreshed their light at planned points rather than waiting until a torch was nearly exhausted, reducing the risk of being caught in total darkness mid-passage. At Chauvet, researchers identified a section of passage where a natural obstacle, a steep drop requiring careful negotiation, is marked by a particularly dense cluster of torchwipe marks on the surrounding walls, consistent with travelers pausing to refresh their light and get their bearings before attempting a difficult section. The physiological demands of this kind of travel deserve direct attention, because they are easy to underestimate from a modern vantage point, where deep cave visits are typically brief, guided, and supported by reliable artificial lighting. Sustained physical exertion in a cold environment increases the rate at which the human body loses heat, even while producing heat internally through movement, and prolonged crawling, climbing, and careful navigation through tight passages, carrying equipment and lighting the entire time, represents genuine sustained physical labor, not a passive walk. Modern show caves that have been adapted for tourism, such as the section of Rouffignac now toured by small electric train, give visitors a badly misleading impression of how physically demanding the original journey through the same passages actually was for someone traveling on foot, crouched low, carrying fuel and pigment, by the light of a single small flame. The presence of children's footprints in some of these same deep, difficult-to-reach chambers, discussed earlier in the case of Tucteau d'Audubert and Fontenay, adds a further dimension to the picture of risk management. Bringing a child on a journey involving narrow crawl spaces, steep descents, cold water, and total darkness implies a level of confidence in the route and the group's ability to manage the hazards involved. It suggests these were not first-time, improvised expeditions into unknown territory, but journeys along a route that had already been tested, learned, and judged survivable by people experienced enough to bring along those less able to handle an unexpected emergency alone. The cave discovered by the diver Henri Cosquer near Marseille in 1991, mentioned earlier in this investigation, offers a particularly vivid illustration of just how far the physical landscape itself has changed since these images were created, and how much additional risk that change has added for anyone studying them today. During the period when the cave was painted, likely between roughly 19,000 and 27,000 years ago, based on radiocarbon dating of charcoal and pigment recovered from several panels, global sea levels stood well over 100 meters lower than they do today, because enormous volumes of the planet's water remained locked in continental ice sheets. The cave entrance that Ice Age painters walked through on dry land now sits more than 100 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, reachable only by a long, dangerous underwater dive through a flooded passage that has killed experienced cave divers attempting to reach it. The paintings themselves, in the cave's upper chambers, remain above the waterline, preserved by the same stable conditions found in dry painted caves elsewhere. But reaching them today requires equipment and training that did not exist for the people who painted them. A reminder that the physical risk documented throughout this investigation was a feature of the Ice Age landscape itself, not an artifact of modern access difficulties layered on top of an otherwise simple destination. All of this evidence, taken together, points toward a consistent pattern across many sites. Deep cave painting was neither accidental nor casual. It required specific route knowledge, careful fuel and light management, an acceptance of real physical danger, and in at least some cases, enough confidence in the safety of a known route to bring children along. The chambers chosen for the most elaborate artistic work were, in many cases, deliberately located past the point of easy access, suggesting the difficulty of the journey itself may have carried meaning, whether as a barrier limiting who could reach and see the finished work, as part of a deliberate process of preparation before painting, or as a shared test of commitment undertaken by a group bound together by the journey itself. This raises an important question the investigation has not yet addressed directly. Every piece of evidence discussed so far, the footprints, the lamps, the pigments, the roots, has come from sites firmly attributed to modern humans, the same species reading this sentence today. But the archaeological record of deep cave use during this period was not limited to a single human species. For decades, one of the deepest assumptions in the study of Ice Age art was that only fully modern humans possessed the cognitive capacity for this kind of symbolic behavior. In the last several years, that assumption has been directly challenged by dating evidence from 3 cave sites in Spain, evidence that, if correct, forces a fundamental reconsideration of who was capable of walking into the dark and why. Chapter 6. A Second Species in the Dark. In February 2018, a team of researchers led by Dirk Hoffman published a study in the journal Science, reporting the results of uranium series dating applied to thin mineral crusts that had formed naturally over painted markings at 3 cave sites in Spain, La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales. Uranium series dating works differently from radiocarbon dating. Instead of measuring the decay of carbon within an organic pigment, it measures the decay of uranium trapped within calcite crusts that slowly form over a painted surface as mineral-rich water seeps through the limestone and deposits a thin coating on top of the art. Because the crust can only form after the painting beneath it already exists, dating the crust provides a minimum age for the painting itself, a floor below which the art cannot be younger, even if it might be considerably older. The results were striking. The calcite crusts covering red pigment markings at all 3 sites returned minimum ages older than 64,000 years. That figure matters enormously, because it predates by a wide margin the currently accepted date for when modern humans first arrived in this part of Europe, generally placed at around 45,000 years ago at the earliest. If the dating was correct, the only human species present in the region at the time these markings were made was Homo neanderthalensis, commonly known as Neanderthals, a species that modern humans had long been assumed to lack the cognitive sophistication for this kind of symbolic mark-making. It is worth being precise about what these 3 sites do and do not contain, because popular coverage of the Hoffman findings has sometimes blurred this distinction. None of the 3 sites features the kind of detailed, anatomically confident animal figures found at Chauvet or Lascaux. The dated material consists exclusively of simpler marks, lines, hand stencils, and pigment applied to natural rock features. This distinction matters for evaluating the claim responsibly. Even if Neanderthal authorship of these specific markings is eventually confirmed beyond current dispute, it would not, by itself, establish that Neanderthals also created the more elaborate, technically advanced animal imagery associated with later, securely modern human sites. It would establish something narrower but still highly significant, that a separate human species was capable of the basic technical and conceptual steps documented throughout this investigation, extracting pigment, carrying it into a cave, and applying it deliberately to a chosen surface deep underground. The markings themselves at these three sites are simpler than the elaborate animal panels found at Chauvet or Lascaux. At La Pasiega, the dated markings include a ladder-shaped pattern of red lines. At Maltravieso, the evidence includes hand stencils, created using the same blown pigment technique documented at later, securely modern human sites. At Ardales, the dated material consists of red pigment applied directly to natural rock formations called speleothems, mineral structures that grow from cave ceilings and floors, in a pattern that appears to follow and highlight the shape of the formation itself rather than depicting a recognizable animal or figure. This finding, if accepted at face value, would represent one of the most significant revisions in the modern understanding of Neanderthal cognitive capacity in decades. It would mean that a separate human species, one that modern humans eventually replaced or absorbed through interbreeding across much of Europe, was independently engaging in exactly the kind of deliberate, symbolic, deep cave mark-making behavior that this documentary has been investigating throughout, using the same pigment technology, the same blown stencil technique, and in at least one case, the same instinct to engage with a striking natural rock formation, decades or millennia before modern humans arrived in the region at all. The Hoffman team's 2018 findings did not emerge in isolation. They followed an earlier round of uranium series dating, published in Science in 2012, by a research team led by Alistair Pike, which had already produced a minimum age of at least 40,800 years for a red disc painted at El Castillo. In northern Spain, a date close enough to the currently accepted arrival of modern humans in the region that it raised the possibility, without confirming it outright, that the earliest layers of painting at that particular site might also have been the work of Neanderthals rather than modern humans. That earlier, somewhat more ambiguous result had already primed the field to take the question seriously well before the more decisive Hoffman dates at La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales were published 6 years later. The broader genetic context surrounding this debate is itself well established, unlike the still contested cave dates. DNA extracted from Neanderthal skeletal remains and compared against the genomes of living modern humans has confirmed that the two populations interbred at multiple points after modern humans began expanding out of Africa, leaving most people of non-African ancestry today carrying a small but measurable percentage of Neanderthal DNA, typically between 1 and 2% of their total genome. This confirms that Neanderthals and modern humans were not separated by an impassable cognitive or biological gulf. They were closely related populations capable of producing fertile offspring together, living in overlapping territory across parts of Europe and Western Asia for a span of several thousand years before Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population sometime around 40,000 years ago. That established genetic closeness makes the possibility of shared or independently developed symbolic behavior, including deep cave mark-making, considerably less surprising on biological grounds than it might have seemed to researchers working a generation ago, when Neanderthals were still widely portrayed as a fundamentally more primitive, less cognitively capable population. The response from the scientific community was not uniform acceptance. Responsible science requires that a claim of this magnitude survive serious scrutiny, in the same tradition established by the Altamira controversy more than a century earlier, and several specialists in dating methodology and Paleolithic archaeology raised substantive concerns. A research team led by Randall White published a detailed critique in 2020, questioning whether uranium series dating of thin, sometimes discontinuous calcite crusts in an active cave environment can reliably produce a minimum age as old as the Hoffman team proposed, given the physical complexity of how these crusts form, dissolve, and reform over time in a natural cave system where water flow is rarely simple or uniform. White and his colleagues argued that contamination, uneven crust formation, and the geological complexity of calcite deposition could produce artificially old dates, and called for additional independent testing before the Neanderthal authorship claim should be treated as established fact. Hoffman and his original research team responded to this critique with further data, and argued that their sampling methodology had specifically accounted for the concerns raised, defending the reliability of their original dates. As of the most recent research available, this scientific disagreement remains genuinely unresolved. It is not a case of one side being obviously right and the other simply wrong. It is a live methodological dispute between specialists who each bring serious expertise and legitimate concerns to a genuinely difficult measurement problem, the kind of disagreement that responsible science is supposed to work through slowly, through additional testing, replication, and open debate, rather than through premature certainty in either direction. This documentary is not in a position to resolve that dispute, and it would not be honest to pretend otherwise. What can be said responsibly is this: credible researchers, using a peer-reviewed dating method applied at 3 independent cave sites, have produced evidence consistent with the possibility that Neanderthals created deliberate pigment markings deep inside painted caves, using techniques materially similar to those used by modern humans tens of thousands of years later. Other credible researchers have raised serious, technically grounded concerns about whether the dating method can support that conclusion with sufficient certainty. Both positions currently coexist within the field, and the honest state of the evidence is that Neanderthal authorship of the oldest markings at La Pasiega, Maltravieso, and Ardales remains a live and contested question rather than a settled fact in either direction. What this dispute changes, regardless of how it is eventually resolved, is the shape of the larger question this documentary set out to answer. If Neanderthals really were creating deliberate markings deep inside caves, independently of modern humans, then the drive to leave a mark in permanent darkness was not a unique invention of our own species. It would have to be something that arose, separately, in at least 2 different branches of the human family tree, suggesting either that the behavior traces back to a shared ancestor common to both species, predating their evolutionary split by hundreds of thousands of years, or that it developed independently, twice, in response to some shared pressure or capacity that both species happen to possess. One further complication deserves mention, because it illustrates just how technically demanding this entire dating debate really is. Uranium series dating depends on measuring the ratio of uranium and its decay products within the calcite crust itself, a process that assumes the crust behaved as what specialists call a closed system, meaning no additional uranium or decay products entered or left the sample after it formed. Natural cave environments, where water continues to move through limestone indefinitely, do not always behave as a perfectly closed system, and detecting departures from that assumption requires careful, sample-specific geochemical testing that is itself an active area of methodological development. This is a genuinely difficult measurement problem, not a simple case of one team being careless and another being careful, and it is worth stating plainly that resolving it will likely require additional independent dating studies, potentially using complementary methods beyond uranium series analysis alone, applied to a wider set of samples than either side has currently published. Even if the Neanderthal dating claim is eventually overturned by further research, and it may be, the debate itself has already changed the field in a lasting way. It has forced researchers to reconsider, more carefully than before, exactly which cognitive and technical capacities are actually required to produce a hand stencil, a red line following a rock formation, or a simple geometric pattern deep inside a cave, and to ask whether those capacities were ever truly unique to modern humans in the first place. That question turns out to connect directly to a separate, equally important puzzle running through the entire archaeological record of painted caves. The images themselves were never a random sample of the natural world visible on the Ice Age landscape. The animals chosen for painting, again and again, across tens of thousands of years and across an enormous geographic range, followed a consistent and deliberate pattern, one that turns out to be one of the strongest clues available for understanding what these images actually meant to the people, or perhaps the people and their Neanderthal contemporaries who made them. Chapter 7. Sound Built into the Rock. In the 1980s, a researcher named Igor Reznikov, working with archaeologist Michel Darvois, began a systematic study of a question almost nobody in the field had asked directly before. Did the acoustic properties of a cave passage, meaning how sound behaves as it travels, echoes and resonates within a particular space, have anything to do with where prehistoric painters chose to place their images? Reznikov, trained originally as a specialist in ancient vocal music, approached several French painted caves, including Niaux, Le Portel, and Arcy-sur-Cure, with a simple experimental method. He walked through each cave system while humming a steady, sustained tone, moving slowly along the passage, and noted where the sound of his own voice changed noticeably, growing louder, developing echo, or producing resonance, a physical phenomenon where certain sound frequencies are naturally amplified by the size and shape of an enclosed space. The results, first published in the late 1980s and expanded in later work, reported a striking correlation. At multiple cave sites, the locations where Reznikov identified the strongest vocal resonance corresponded closely with the locations of painted panels, while sections of passage with poor or muffled acoustics tended to correspond with areas containing few or no images. In some caves, he reported that even small, seemingly unremarkable red dots painted on otherwise blank stretches of wall lined up with points of unusually strong sound reflection, as though marking a location that had already been identified, through sound alone, as somehow significant before any image was added. Reznikov extended his method further at some sites, testing not just where resonance occurred but whether specific painted marks, including simple dots and short lines that do not depict any recognizable animal, appeared to function as markers placed at points of especially strong sound reflection along an otherwise dark and disorienting passage, potentially serving a practical wayfinding purpose alongside any symbolic meaning the marks might also have carried. This possibility, that some abstract signs functioned partly as an early form of acoustic or spatial signage guiding travelers safely through a known route, adds a further layer of interpretation to the sign catalogue discussed later in this investigation, one grounded in the practical demands of safe navigation rather than symbolic meaning alone. This finding, if accurate and replicable, would suggest something genuinely important: that Ice Age visitors to these caves were paying close attention not just to what they could see by lamplight, but to what they could hear, and that sound may have played a direct role in determining where certain images were placed. A resonant chamber, where a human voice, a chant, a rhythmic sound, or a simple vocalization would ring out with unusual power, could plausibly have felt like a meaningful location within an otherwise disorienting, featureless environment of total darkness, a place singled out by the physical properties of the rock itself, rather than by human choice alone. Responsible science, however, requires treating this finding with real caution, for reasons connected directly to the methodology used to establish it. Reznikov's original studies relied primarily on his own subjective assessment of resonance, made by ear while moving through the caves himself. This approach carries an obvious risk of unconscious bias. A researcher who already knows where the painted panels are located, because they are visible on the cave wall in front of him, may unconsciously judge the acoustics at those exact points more favorably than the acoustics at unpainted stretches of passage, without deliberately intending to skew the results. Later researchers attempting to test Reznikov's findings using more objective, instrument-based acoustic measurement, recording actual sound pressure levels and resonance frequencies with calibrated equipment, rather than relying on subjective human hearing, have produced more mixed results. Some studies have found a real, measurable correlation between painted locations and acoustic properties at certain sites. Others have found the correlation weaker or less consistent than Reznikov's original work suggested, and have raised the concern that human perception of resonance is itself variable enough, from person to person and moment to moment, that any correlation found through subjective listening alone should be treated as preliminary rather than conclusive. This is exactly the kind of situation the evidence certainty standard applied throughout this documentary is designed to handle honestly. The acoustic hypothesis is not baseless invention. It is a testable, published, peer-reviewed line of research, grounded in real fieldwork conducted inside real caves, using a method that produced a genuine documented pattern at several sites. But it has not yet reached the level of confirmation that would allow it to be presented as an established fact. It remains, at the current state of research, a responsible inference supported by partial evidence, an idea taken seriously by specialists in the field, but still awaiting the kind of independent, instrument-based replication across a wider sample of sites that would be needed to move it from plausible hypothesis to settled conclusion. What can be said with more confidence because it rests on more secure ground is that deep cave environments are, as a simple matter of physics, dramatically different acoustic spaces from the open landscape where Ice Age people spent the overwhelming majority of their lives. A voice, a rhythmic strike against stone, or the crackle of a torch flame behaves in a confined stone chamber in ways that have no real equivalent above ground, under open sky, where sound dissipates quickly into open air. Anyone entering these spaces, regardless of whether they consciously sought out particular acoustic properties for painting, would have experienced an unfamiliar and likely striking sensory environment. Total visual darkness, combined with sound behaving in unusual, sometimes disorienting ways, layered on top of genuine physical exertion, cold temperatures, and the psychological pressure of navigating an environment that offered no possibility of quick escape. Some of the clearest documented evidence for how extended time in a cave environment affects human perception comes from a different, much more recent line of research entirely. Controlled scientific isolation experiments conducted by researchers studying human chronobiology, the internal rhythms that govern sleep, waking, and the perception of time. Beginning in the 1960s, French scientist Michel Siffre spent extended periods, in some cases several months, living alone deep inside cave systems, specifically to study how the absence of natural light and normal daily cues affected his own body and mind. Siffre and later researchers following similar protocols consistently documented significant disruption to normal sleep-wake cycles, and notably, a persistent and measurable distortion in subjects' ability to accurately judge how much time had passed, with subjects in extended darkness typically underestimating elapsed time by a wide margin compared to clock time recorded outside the cave. This body of modern research does not tell us what any specific Ice Age painter experienced during a much shorter visit lasting hours rather than months. But it confirms, through direct controlled measurement, that the human nervous system responds to extended time in total darkness in ways that measurably depart from ordinary daylight experience. Lending scientific weight to the more cautious, evidence-grounded version of the argument that deep cave environments may have felt psychologically distinct from ordinary life, without requiring this documentary to make any specific claim about trance states, spiritual visions, or altered consciousness that the archaeological evidence alone cannot verify. That combination of sensory conditions, whatever role acoustics specifically played in the placement of individual images, helps explain why deep cave interiors may have felt qualitatively different from any other space available to Ice Age people, a space set apart from ordinary daily experience simply by virtue of how profoundly unfamiliar it was to move through. Modern researchers studying the psychology of extended time spent in total darkness and sensory deprivation, including controlled experiments involving cavers and volunteers in isolation chambers, have documented measurable effects on perception, mood, and cognitive state after even relatively short periods without visual input, including altered time perception and, in some cases, spontaneous visual phenomena generated internally by the brain rather than by any external light source. Whether or not Ice Age painters experienced anything resembling these documented modern effects cannot be established directly from physical evidence, and this documentary will not claim that it can. But the physical conditions capable of producing such effects, extended time in total darkness, physical exertion, cold and unusual acoustic environments, were unquestionably present, verified directly by the archaeological record already discussed, the torchwipe marks, the lamp fragments, the footprints, and the deep, difficult routes leading to the painted chambers themselves. Paul Barn, the same researcher who raised substantive objections to the neuropsychological interpretation of animal imagery discussed later in this investigation, has applied a similar note of caution to the acoustic hypothesis specifically. Barn has pointed out that resonance and echo are common properties of many enclosed stone spaces generally, not a rare or unique feature limited to the specific chambers that happen to contain paintings, and has cautioned that researchers searching for a correlation between sound and image placement may be at risk of noticing and reporting confirming examples more readily than disconfirming ones, a general pattern recognized across many fields of science, and not a criticism unique to this particular line of research. This kind of caution does not mean the acoustic hypothesis is wrong. It means that, like several other explanations examined throughout this investigation, it remains a genuine, serious, evidence-grounded possibility rather than an established conclusion, and the honest state of current research reflects that distinction rather than resolving it. Independent instrument-based studies conducted since Resnikoff's original fieldwork have attempted to move this question toward firmer ground. Researchers using calibrated microphones and sound level meters to measure resonance frequencies systematically along cave passages, rather than relying on a single researcher's ear, have reported that certain sites do show a statistically detectable relationship between measured acoustic properties and the location of painted or engraved imagery, while other sites tested using the same rigorous methodology show a weaker or statistically inconclusive relationship. This mixed pattern across sites is itself informative. It suggests that acoustic considerations may have played a meaningful role in image placement at some caves, for some painters, without necessarily being a universal rule applied consistently across the entire tradition of deep cave painting everywhere it occurred. Understanding the physical and sensory environment of the caves helps explain how the experience of painting, and perhaps of simply being present, might have felt distinct from ordinary life. It does not yet explain the specific content of the images themselves, why painters across an enormous span of time and geography kept returning, again and again, to a strikingly narrow, consistent set of animal subjects, while other animals that Ice Age people certainly knew, hunted, and depended on for survival appear only rarely, or not at all, on the walls of these caves. That pattern, once examined directly, turns out to be one of the clearest and most consistent pieces of evidence available for what these images were actually meant to represent. Chapter 8. Animals Chosen on Purpose. If Ice Age cave art simply reflected daily life, a kind of visual diary of what people ate and depended on for survival, the walls of these caves should be dominated by the animals that archaeological evidence shows people actually hunted and ate most often. That evidence is well established through a separate line of research entirely: the study of animal bones recovered from Ice Age campsites and cave floor deposits, which reveal butchery marks, cooking evidence, and the relative frequency of different species in the diet of the people living in a given region during a given period. In most parts of Ice Age France and Spain, that dietary evidence is dominated overwhelmingly by reindeer, which appear to have made up the large majority of meat consumed across many sites and time periods. The painted animals on cave walls tell a strikingly different story. Reindeer, despite being the primary food source at many sites, are dramatically underrepresented in cave art relative to their dietary importance. At Lascaux, researchers cataloguing the painted and engraved figures found that horses account for the largest single category of animal images, followed by aurochs, a large wild ancestor of domestic cattle, and stags, while reindeer, the actual dietary staple of the people who created the art, appear only rarely. At Chauvet, the pattern shifts toward a different but equally telling set of species. The cave contains an unusually large number of images depicting dangerous predators and megafauna, including lions, woolly rhinoceroses, mammoths, cave bears, and hyenas, animals that would have posed a direct physical threat to Ice Age humans, but that made up only a small fraction of the recovered dietary bone evidence from the surrounding region. This mismatch between what people actually ate and what they chose to paint has been documented systematically across dozens of painted cave sites by researchers compiling large comparative databases of cave art imagery, and it holds up as a consistent pattern rather than an isolated coincidence at one or two locations. Across the broader corpus of French and Spanish Ice Age cave art, horses and bison are the two most frequently depicted animals overall, followed by aurochs, ibex, deer, and mammoths, with dangerous predators such as lions, bears, and hyenas appearing in smaller total numbers but concentrated disproportionately in certain sites, particularly Chauvet. Reindeer, despite dominating the archaeological dietary record at many of these same sites, remain consistently underrepresented in painted imagery across the corpus as a whole. This is exactly the kind of pattern that responsible archaeological reasoning treats as meaningful evidence rather than coincidence, because it repeats consistently across independent sites separated by significant distance and time, and because it cannot be easily explained by chance or by simple practical convenience. If the goal had simply been decorative variety, or an accurate visual record of the local environment, reindeer, as the animal Ice Age people encountered and depended on constantly, should logically appear at least as often as horses or bison. Instead, the imagery consistently privileges a specific subset of animals, generally large, often physically imposing, or genuinely dangerous species, over the animal that formed the actual backbone of daily survival. The mismatch between diet and imagery is not limited to the reindeer example already discussed. At several sites, fish and birds, both well documented in the broader Ice Age archaeological record as food sources through recovered bone remains, are almost entirely absent from painted imagery, despite their practical dietary importance in many regions and periods. Small mammals, similarly well represented in the bone record at many campsites, receive only minimal attention on cave walls. The pattern holds in the same direction every time it has been tested across a new site. The animals people relied on most heavily for calories are consistently the animals painted least often, while a comparatively narrow set of large, often physically striking or dangerous species receives the overwhelming majority of artistic attention. A further complication worth noting responsibly is that the underrepresentation of reindeer in painted imagery is not perfectly uniform across every site and every period. At certain locations and time horizons within the broader Magdalenian tradition, reindeer do appear with somewhat greater frequency than the overall pattern would suggest, and a small number of sites contain detailed, carefully observed reindeer engravings that show the same technical mastery documented elsewhere for horses and bison. Responsible interpretation of the species selection pattern therefore treats it as a strong, well-documented overall tendency across the corpus as a whole, rather than an absolute rule without exception at every individual site, a distinction that matters for avoiding the kind of overstated certainty this documentary has cautioned against throughout. Researchers have proposed several responsible interpretations for this pattern, and it is important to state clearly that no single explanation currently commands universal agreement across the field. One long-influential interpretation, associated closely with the French prehistorian Abbé Henri Breuil in the early 20th century, proposed that cave paintings functioned as a form of hunting magic, images created to symbolically influence the success of an actual hunt, perhaps by depicting an animal already wounded or by asserting a kind of ritual power over the species before the hunt took place. This theory had obvious appeal, and it offered a straightforward, tidy explanation. But later researchers pointed out a significant problem. The species most heavily hunted for food, primarily reindeer, are not the species most heavily depicted, which is difficult to reconcile with a theory centered specifically on hunting success. Some physical evidence does appear to support a version of the hunting magic hypothesis at specific sites, even if it cannot explain the overall pattern of species selection on its own. At a small number of locations, painted animals show what appear to be deliberately added marks resembling spear or dart wounds, incorporated into the original image rather than added later, and researchers have documented a small number of images where an animal appears to be rendered in a posture suggesting collapse or death. This evidence suggests that some images, at some sites, may indeed have carried a meaning connected to hunting success or ritual practice tied to the hunt, without requiring that explanation to account for every painted image across every cave in the broader tradition. Responsible interpretation in this field increasingly favors this kind of site-specific, image-specific caution over a single grand theory intended to explain every painted animal everywhere, precisely because the underlying evidence itself varies meaningfully from cave to cave and from panel to panel. A different, more recent, and currently more widely discussed interpretation, developed extensively by the South African archaeologist David Lewis Williams, argues that the imagery reflects not everyday hunting concerns, but a symbolic engagement with a spirit world, accessed through altered states of consciousness, potentially induced through prolonged sensory deprivation, rhythmic activity, or extended time spent in total darkness of exactly the kind documented earlier in this investigation. Under this model, sometimes called the neuropsychological model, the animals chosen for depiction, particularly large, powerful, or dangerous species, may have held symbolic significance connected to spiritual power, transformation, or a boundary between the human world and a perceived other world, rather than a direct connection to daily nutrition. Lewis Williams has pointed to the specific choice of dangerous predator species at Chauvet and to certain unusual, part human, part animal figures found at a small number of sites, as evidence supporting this interpretation. This theory, while influential and taken seriously within the field, has also drawn substantial and well-reasoned criticism. Archaeologist Paul Barn, among others, has argued that the neuropsychological model rests heavily on cross-cultural comparisons to modern and historically documented shamanic societies that may not accurately reflect the beliefs of Ice Age Europeans, who left no written record of their own beliefs and whose actual religious or symbolic framework cannot be directly recovered from physical evidence alone. Barn and other critics caution that projecting a specific, detailed spiritual framework onto the available physical evidence risks overstating what the evidence can actually support, converting a responsible inference into something that sounds more certain than the underlying material actually justifies. A detailed census of Chauvet's painted imagery, compiled by researcher Jean Clotz and his colleagues following the cave's discovery, documented 447 individually identifiable painted animals across the cave system, and the species breakdown reinforces the general pattern described above with unusual precision. Horses account for the largest single group, numbering roughly a third of the total, followed by mammoths, and then a striking concentration of dangerous predator species, including lions, at over 70 individual images, making Chauvet home to one of the largest known concentrations of predator imagery at any painted cave site in Europe. Reindeer, again, appear only a handful of times across the entire cave, a near-total absence given how thoroughly the species dominates the dietary bone record from the same broad region and period. Equally significant, and often overlooked in popular discussion of cave art, is how rarely human figures appear at all across the entire body of Ice Age European cave art. Where animal images number in the many thousands across the full corpus of known sites, fully realistic human figures are exceptionally rare, and the few that do exist are often partial, stylized, or combined with animal features in ways that make their intended meaning genuinely difficult to interpret. The most famous example, a painted figure at the cave of Trois Frères in the French Pyrenees, often referred to informally as the Sorcerer, combines what appear to be human legs and torso with antlers, an owl-like face, and other features drawn from multiple different animal species, a hybrid image that has been proposed, cautiously, as evidence of costume, disguise, or transformation, though its exact meaning remains genuinely unresolved. This scarcity of straightforward human imagery, set against the abundance and technical mastery applied to animal imagery, is itself a pattern that any complete explanation for cave art has to account for, and it lends further weight to the conclusion that these images were not simply a visual record of daily human life, in which human beings themselves might be expected to appear at least as often as the animals around them. Between these two major interpretive frameworks sits a body of more cautious, evidence-focused research that avoids committing fully to either a hunting magic explanation or a shamanic spiritual explanation, and instead focuses on what can be established with greater confidence. That the selection of animals depicted on cave walls was clearly deliberate and non-random, that it consistently privileged certain species over others regardless of their actual dietary importance, and that this pattern held remarkably stable across enormous spans of time and geography, sometimes across periods separated by more than 10,000 years. Whatever specific belief system stood behind that selection, and this documentary does not claim to know its exact content with certainty, the consistency of the pattern itself demonstrates that Ice Age painters were working from a shared, transmitted set of ideas about which animals mattered enough to paint, ideas stable enough to persist across many human generations and across a wide geographic range covering hundreds of kilometers. That consistency points towards something important about how this knowledge moved between people and across time, a question the investigation will return to directly in its final chapters. But the animal figures were never the whole story painted on these walls. Alongside the horses, bison, lions, and mammoths, cave walls throughout the same period are covered in a second, very different category of markings, abstract signs that depict no recognizable animal at all, and that turn out to follow a pattern just as consistent, and in some ways even more surprising, than the choice of animals themselves. Chapter 9. The marks that were not animals. Alongside the painted animals that dominate popular imagination and museum reconstructions of Ice Age cave art, the walls of painted caves throughout France and Spain are covered in a second category of imagery that receives far less public attention, but has, in recent years, become the subject of serious, dedicated research. Simple, repeated, non-figurative marks, including dots, lines, grids, zigzags, cross-hatching, and a small number of other recurring geometric shapes. These marks are not rare or incidental additions to the animal panels. In many caves, they are just as numerous as the figurative images, and in some cases, considerably more common. The researcher most associated with the systematic study of this material is Genevieve von Petzinger, who compiled a large comparative database cataloguing non-figurative signs from painted cave sites across a wide swath of Ice Age Europe, spanning tens of thousands of years and hundreds of kilometers. Her research identified a striking pattern. Rather than representing an essentially unlimited, freely improvised range of possible abstract marks, the geometric signs found across this enormous span of time and geography cluster into a surprisingly small, repeated set, generally counted at around 32 distinct recurring sign types, appearing again and again at different sites, created by different groups of people, separated by vast distances and by spans of time, reaching into the tens of thousands of years. Von Petzinger's database drew on published records from more than 300 sites across France alone, later expanded to include additional sites elsewhere in Europe, representing one of the largest systematic compilations of this specific category of evidence ever assembled. Building a database of this scale required standardizing how researchers across many decades, working at many different sites with varying documentation practices, had originally recorded and classified these marks, a substantial methodological undertaking in its own right, separate from the interpretive questions that followed once the data had been assembled. This finding carries significant weight. For the same reason, the consistent selection of animal species discussed in the previous chapter carries weight. A truly random, unconstrained set of markings, made independently by unconnected groups with no shared tradition, would be expected to show far more variation than this. The fact that specific sign types, such as a particular dot pattern or a particular type of cross-hatched grid, recur consistently across enormous distances and time spans, suggests that these were not spontaneous, meaningless doodles. They represent, at minimum, a shared visual vocabulary, learned, transmitted, and maintained across many generations of people who had, by definition, never met each other in person, given the time spans involved. What that shared vocabulary actually communicated remains genuinely uncertain, and responsible researchers, including von Petzinger herself, are careful to distinguish between what the pattern demonstrates and what it might eventually be shown to mean. Von Petzinger has proposed, cautiously, that the consistency and repetition of these signs may represent an early stage in the development of symbolic communication, potentially functioning in ways that anticipate, without yet constituting, the kind of information storage later achieved by fully developed writing systems, which would not emerge anywhere in the world for tens of thousands of years after the oldest cave signs were made. This hypothesis does not claim that Ice Age people had invented writing. It suggests, more cautiously, that they had developed a stable, transmitted system of meaningful marks, which may have functioned as a kind of proto-symbolic code, understood within a particular cultural tradition, even if its specific content cannot be recovered by researchers today, who have no surviving key to translate it. This proto-writing hypothesis, while taken seriously within the field and grounded in a real, carefully documented pattern of repetition, remains one of the areas of cave art research where the gap between the physical evidence and the interpretive claim is widest, and it deserves to be treated with particular caution here. The evidence establishes with strong confidence that a limited, repeated set of non-figurative signs exists across a very wide span of time and geography. It does not establish with anything close to the same confidence what those signs actually communicated, whether they functioned as anything resembling language, counting, calendar tracking, clan identity, or something else entirely that may not have a close modern equivalent at all. Some researchers have proposed narrower, more specific interpretations for certain sign types, including a hypothesis connecting particular dot and line sequences to lunar or seasonal counting systems. But these narrower claims rest on considerably thinner and more contested evidence than the broader observation that a repeated sign vocabulary existed at all. Von Petzinger's catalogue documented specific recurring sign categories with names now widely used across the field, including simple dots, straight and curved lines, grids, and a distinctive branching shape known as a tectiform, found repeatedly at a cluster of caves in the Lot region of France, including Pec Merle and Cugnac, but rarely documented outside that specific area, suggesting that alongside the small set of signs found almost everywhere across the broader tradition, certain sign types may have carried more localized, regional significance, understood within a smaller cultural network rather than the entire span of Ice Age European painters. This mixture of a widely shared core vocabulary, alongside more regionally specific variations, mirrors, in a rough and cautious way, patterns familiar from later, better documented human symbolic systems, where certain core conventions spread widely, while local dialects, styles, or variations remain confined to smaller regions. The hand stencils found at Gargas, in the French Pyrenees, add a further, genuinely puzzling piece of evidence to this picture. Many of the roughly 200 hand stencils documented at the site show one or more finger joints missing or folded out of view during the stenciling process, rather than a complete, fully extended hand. Researchers have proposed several competing explanations for this pattern. One hypothesis suggests the missing segments reflect genuine physical injury or frostbite, common enough in a cold Ice Age environment to explain the pattern across multiple individuals. A second hypothesis proposes that the folded fingers were deliberate, representing a kind of hand sign code, potentially communicating specific information through finger position in a manner comparable to sign language conventions documented in some later human cultures. A third, more cautious position notes that both explanations remain genuinely unproven, and that the true explanation may vary from case to case, some folded fingers reflecting injury, others reflecting deliberate signing, without a way to reliably distinguish between the two from the physical evidence of the stencil alone. This documentary treats the Gargas hand pattern the same way it has treated every other genuinely contested question raised throughout this investigation, as a real, well-documented phenomenon with more than one responsible explanation currently in circulation, rather than a solved mystery with a single confirmed answer. A separate but related discovery adds a further layer to this picture. Researchers Marc Azéma and Florent Rivière, studying a specific subset of painted animal images across several caves, identified a technique that appears to represent a deliberate attempt to suggest motion, specifically by overlapping multiple slightly different versions of an animal's legs or head in a single figure, in a manner that, when viewed by flickering torchlight or lamplight, can create an illusion of movement not unlike the basic principle behind early animation. At Chauvet, one painted horse's head appears rendered with what looks like 8 overlapping legs beneath a running body, a technique consistent with depicting sequential motion rather than a single static pose. Azéma and Rivière have also documented small carved bone and antler discs from other Ice Age sites, decorated with 2 related images on opposite faces, that when spun rapidly on a cord threaded through a central hole, appear to blend the 2 images into a single combined moving scene, a device sometimes referred to informally as a Paleolithic thaumatrope, after a similar toy popularized in the 19th century. This evidence, while limited to a relatively small number of documented examples, and therefore appropriately treated as a genuine but narrower finding rather than a universal feature of all cave art, nonetheless demonstrates something significant about the cognitive sophistication involved in this period. People were not simply copying static shapes from memory. In at least some cases, they were experimenting deliberately with how a static image, viewed under specific, flickering lighting conditions unique to the deep cave environment already documented earlier in this investigation, could be made to suggest motion, change, and time passing, an artistic problem that required real conceptual understanding of how vision and perception actually work. The Cosca Cave, already discussed for its submerged entrance and its unusually long span of use, adds a further data point to the sign catalogue as well. Alongside its painted animals, which include an unusual concentration of marine species such as seals and what researchers have identified as auk-like seabirds, rare subjects at inland cave sites, Cosca also contains hand stencils and simple linear signs consistent with the broader vocabulary documented by von Petzinger at inland caves hundreds of kilometers away, despite the site's coastal location and distinct animal subject matter. This consistency, appearing even at a site whose specific animal imagery reflects a clearly different local environment, reinforces the conclusion that the abstract sign vocabulary and the animal selection patterns discussed in the previous chapter operated as at least partially independent traditions, layered together rather than dictated by a single, simple rule tying image content directly and exclusively to the immediate local landscape. Taken together, the abstract sign system documented by von Petzinger and the motion techniques documented by Azéma and Rivière point toward the same broad conclusion already suggested by the deliberate, non-random selection of animal species discussed in the previous chapter. The people creating this art, across an enormous span of time and an enormous geographic range, were working within a shared, transmitted framework of meaningful visual conventions, refined and maintained across generations, applied with real technical skill, and adapted specifically to the unique sensory conditions of the environment in which it was created. Whatever specific beliefs, stories, or systems of meaning stood behind that framework, and this documentary has been careful throughout to distinguish between what the physical evidence can support and what remains genuine speculation, the framework itself was neither accidental nor improvised. It had to be taught, learned, and carried forward, deliberately, by people who valued its continuation enough to keep returning to the same caves, sometimes across thousands of years, to add to it. That pattern of return, documented directly in the archaeological layering of many painted caves, where later generations added new images alongside, and sometimes directly over, work created by people many centuries or millennia before them, is the final and in some ways most important piece of physical evidence this investigation has to examine. It speaks directly to the question the entire documentary set out to answer from its opening scene, not simply why one person made one journey into the dark, but why an entire tradition of people, across an almost unimaginable span of human generations, kept deciding that the darkness was worth returning to. Chapter 10. Generations who kept returning. Painted caves are not, in most cases, the product of a single visit by a single group of people at a single moment in time. Careful excavation and stylistic analysis of many major sites has revealed that they were used, added to, and revisited repeatedly across spans of time that dwarf any individual human lifetime. At Chauvet, radiocarbon dating of different charcoal samples taken from different painted panels within the same cave system has identified at least 2 distinct periods of activity, separated by more than 5,000 years, meaning that later visitors to the cave were adding new images alongside work created by people who lived and died roughly 200 human generations before them, with no possibility of direct memory or living connection between the two groups, beyond whatever knowledge had been carried forward, somehow, across that enormous gap. The mechanism by which researchers distinguish separate phases of activity within a single cave relies on multiple independent lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion, a standard of proof consistent with the caution applied throughout this investigation. Stylistic differences in how animals are rendered, changes in the specific pigment recipe used from one panel to another, direct radiocarbon dates on charcoal pigment where available, and the physical stratigraphy of sediment and mineral crust layers that have formed over some images but not others, all contribute independent evidence toward reconstructing a chronological sequence of use. Where these different lines of evidence agree with one another, as they do at Chauvet, Niaux, and several other well-studied sites, researchers can state with real confidence that a cave was used across multiple distinct periods, even without knowing the specific identities or beliefs of the people responsible for each phase. At other sites, the evidence for repeated use spans even longer. Niaux and several nearby caves in the same river valley show evidence of use across several distinct phases within the Magdalenian period, a broad span of Ice Age European prehistory lasting roughly from 17,000 to 12,000 years ago. Rouffignac contains work created across a similarly extended period. In several caves, later artists appear to have deliberately worked around, rather than over, existing images created long before them, suggesting a degree of respect for, or recognition of the earlier work, even though the people creating the newer images could have had no personal memory of who had painted the older ones, or precisely when. This pattern of extended intergenerational use raises a genuinely difficult question that connects directly back to several earlier chapters of this investigation. How did knowledge of a specific cave, its route, its dangers, its painted content, and whatever meaning was attached to it, survive across gaps of thousands of years, when the people using the cave in one period could not possibly have had direct living contact with the people who had used it in an earlier period, separated by more than 100 generations? The physical evidence cannot answer this question with certainty, but it does allow for some responsible inference, grounded in what is already known about the caves themselves. The consistency of technique documented throughout this investigation, the same basic pigment preparation methods, the same lamp designs, the same blown stencil technique for hand images, the same limited, repeated vocabulary of abstract signs identified by von Petzinger, the same broad pattern of species selection favoring horses, bison, and dangerous predators over dietary staples like reindeer, All of this suggests a genuinely remarkable degree of cultural continuity, maintained not within a single group over a single lifetime, but across a scale of time that modern human societies rarely manage to sustain any single tradition across intact and recognizable. Whatever mechanism allowed this knowledge to persist, whether through oral storytelling passed between generations, through the deliberate, supervised training of young people in specific techniques and locations, through the physical act of guiding children on the same demanding underground journeys documented by the footprint evidence at Touques-d'Audubert and Fontenay, or through some combination of all of these, the practical result was a tradition robust enough to survive interruptions, migrations, climate shifts, and generational turnover across a span of time that is difficult to fully grasp in human terms. The Cosca Cave, discussed earlier in this investigation for the way rising sea levels have submerged its original entrance, offers an unusually precise illustration of just how long this kind of return could extend. Dating of different painted panels within the cave, using both radiocarbon analysis of charcoal pigment and stylistic comparison, indicates that the site was visited and painted across a span of roughly 8,000 years, from around 27,000 years ago to around 19,000 years ago, a period during which the surrounding coastline itself was slowly transformed by the retreat and advance of glacial ice, and during which the entrance to the cave would have stood at a very different distance from the sea with each passing millennium. People returning to Cosca across that span were not simply revisiting a fixed, unchanging location. They were returning to a place whose surrounding landscape had itself changed dramatically across the same period that the tradition of painting inside it continued, a detail that underscores just how resilient the underlying cultural knowledge required to have been, surviving not only human generational turnover, but genuine large-scale environmental change occurring around it. This is where the footprint evidence discussed early in this investigation becomes especially significant when considered alongside everything documented since. A child's footprint pressed into cave clay 8 to 10,000 years before the invention of writing anywhere in the world was not simply the trace of a young person along for the walk. It represents, quite plausibly, one link in an actual chain of deliberate cultural transmission, a mechanism by which specific knowledge, specific skills, and specific meaning were physically carried forward from one generation to the next, inside one of the only environments available to Ice Age people that offered genuine physical permanence, a sealed, stable, undisturbed cave chamber, protected from the erosion, weather, and destruction that would have erased almost any equivalent record left in the open air. Modern conservation science has added a further, practical dimension to how researchers now think about the caves these painters chose, one that indirectly confirms just how well-suited deep, stable cave environments were for long-term preservation compared with almost any alternative available on the Ice Age landscape. When Lascaux was opened to public tourism in the years following its 1940 discovery, the combined heat, humidity, and carbon dioxide, introduced by thousands of visiting bodies each day, began to measurably alter the cave's internal climate, eventually triggering the growth of algae and mineral deposits that threatened to damage the paintings themselves, and the original cave was closed to the public in 1963, with a nearby replica built instead to satisfy public interest without risking further harm. That episode demonstrates, in a very direct and modern way, just how precisely balanced the natural conditions inside these caves have to remain for their contents to survive intact across tens of thousands of years, and how easily even a well-intentioned modern intervention can disturb a stability that took nothing more than an undisturbed passage, sealed off from daylight and open air, to maintain naturally for millennia before anyone in the modern era ever set foot inside. That permanence may itself be part of the answer to the central question this documentary has been investigating from its opening scene. Ice Age people, unlike modern researchers, had no way of knowing with certainty how long their painted images would last. But the deep cave environment they chose, again and again, across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years, happened to be one of the very few environments on the Ice Age landscape capable of preserving a mark essentially unchanged for tens of thousands of years, protected from sun, rain, wind, and the ordinary decay that destroys almost everything else a human being creates. Whether or not the painters fully understood the extraordinary durability of what they were creating, the caves they chose gave their work a kind of permanence that nothing painted in open daylight, on a cliff face or a rock shelter exposed to weather, could ever have matched. This suggests a responsible, evidence-grounded answer to part of the mystery that does not require resolving every unanswered question about specific ritual belief, spiritual meaning, or altered states of consciousness discussed in earlier chapters. Whatever additional meaning the paintings held, whether connected to hunting, to a perceived spirit world, to acoustic properties of resonant chambers, or to some combination not fully recoverable from physical evidence alone, the caves also functioned, in practical terms, as one of the only reliable long-term storage systems available to people who had no writing, no permanent settlements in the modern sense, and no other durable medium capable of preserving a shared visual tradition across a time span long enough to outlast any individual human memory. That function, storage and transmission across time, does not compete with the other proposed explanations examined throughout this investigation. It sits alongside them, compatible with a hunting-related purpose in some contexts, compatible with a spiritual or symbolic purpose in others, compatible with the acoustic patterns documented by Resnikoff, and compatible with the proto-symbolic sign system documented by von Petzinger. The caves may well have served several of these purposes simultaneously, layered on top of each other across different visits, different generations, and different specific intentions, in the same way that a single sacred or significant location in almost any human culture, ancient or modern, typically accumulates multiple, overlapping layers of meaning over time, rather than serving one single, static function forever. Some researchers have looked to modern and historically documented societies that maintained oral traditions across many generations without writing, for cautious comparative insight into how detailed cultural knowledge can survive such long stretches of time through spoken transmission alone, careful apprenticeship, and repeated supervised practice passed from elder to younger member of a community. This documentary treats such comparisons with real caution, in keeping with the evidentiary standard applied throughout, because no living or historically documented society can be assumed to accurately represent the specific beliefs or practices of Ice Age Europeans, who left no descendants practicing an unbroken version of the same tradition today. What these comparisons can responsibly offer is a demonstration that human oral and practical transmission systems, generally, are capable of preserving detailed, specific knowledge across many generations without writing, a capacity documented directly and repeatedly in the historical and ethnographic record, even if the specific content of what Ice Age communities transmitted about their painted caves cannot be recovered. What remains beyond serious dispute, after following the physical evidence from the footprints in the clay to the pigment ground in stone bowls, from the torchwipe marks on the passage walls to the deliberate, non-random selection of animal species, from the repeated geometric signs to the extended, multi-generational pattern of return, is that deep cave painting represented one of the most sustained, most technically demanding, and most physically dangerous cultural traditions documented anywhere in the archaeological record of the deep human past. It was not an accident. It was not a simple decoration. It was a deliberate, repeated, carefully transmitted choice, made by countless individual people across an almost incomprehensible span of time, to walk into total darkness, carrying fire, pigment, and knowledge passed down from people they had never met, in order to leave something behind that they themselves would likely never see again after the flame in their lamp finally went out. Conclusion. Return for a moment to the woman on her hands and knees in the opening scene of this documentary, crawling through total darkness toward a chamber she may have visited before, carrying fire and pigment toward a wall she intended to paint. The evidence gathered across this investigation cannot tell us her name, her exact thoughts, or the precise words she might have used to explain, if asked, why she was willing to risk the journey. That kind of certainty does not survive in the archaeological record, and no honest documentary can manufacture it. But the physical evidence left behind by thousands of people like her across tens of thousands of years and hundreds of kilometers of French and Spanish cave systems does allow for a responsible, evidence-grounded answer to the question this documentary set out to investigate. The darkness was not an obstacle people merely tolerated in pursuit of some other goal that could have been achieved more easily elsewhere. The darkness, and the extraordinary difficulty of reaching it, appears to have been part of the point. Painters consistently pushed past easier, more visible locations near cave entrances to work in the deepest, most physically demanding chambers they could safely reach, chambers requiring careful management of fire, painstakingly prepared pigment, and root knowledge built and tested across repeated visits, sometimes passed down across gaps of thousands of years between one generation of painters and the next. Whatever specific meaning stood behind any individual image, the underlying pattern is unmistakable. This behavior was deliberate, learned, and valued highly enough to justify real, sometimes fatal risk, over and over, by countless different people who could not have known one another and could not have coordinated directly across the spans of time involved. The images themselves, once reached, were never a simple visual record of ordinary life. The animals chosen for painting consistently diverged from the animals people actually depended on for food, favoring horses, bison, aurochs, and, at certain sites, an unusually heavy concentration of dangerous predators over the reindeer that filled most Ice Age dinner tables across the same regions and periods. Alongside those animals, a separate, smaller, and remarkably consistent vocabulary of abstract signs, dots, lines, grids, and a small set of other recurring shapes appears across an enormous geographic and chronological range, evidence of a shared visual tradition transmitted deliberately across generations who never met. This documentary has been careful, throughout, to separate what this evidence can establish with confidence from what remains genuinely uncertain, in keeping with a caution the field itself learned the hard way, beginning with the dismissal and eventual vindication of Sautuola's discovery at Altamira more than a century ago. The precise content of the belief system, or systems, that motivated this behavior cannot be fully recovered. Whether the caves served primarily a role connected to hunting, to a perceived spirit world, to acoustic properties that made certain chambers feel meaningfully different from ordinary space, to practical information storage in an age before writing, or, as the evidence increasingly suggests, to some combination of several of these functions layered together across different sites and different periods, remains an active, honest, unresolved question, one that continues to generate serious, carefully argued disagreement among specialists who have devoted entire careers to studying it. The recent, still contested possibility that some of the very earliest markings may belong not to modern humans at all, but to Neanderthals, a separate human species with whom our own ancestors interbred and eventually coexisted across parts of the same landscape, only deepens the sense that this behavior reaches further back and involves a wider circle of the human family than researchers understood even a decade ago. What does not remain in doubt is the sheer scale of commitment the evidence documents. People gathered pigment from sources sometimes kilometers from the cave. They rendered animal fat and prepared wicks to build lamps, capable of burning steadily in a damp, freezing, airless passage. They memorized routes through total darkness precise enough to guide children safely along them. They refreshed their torches at consistent, practiced intervals, avoiding the genuine danger of being caught with no working light far from any possible help. And, having done all of that, they knelt on cold stone in a chamber that daylight had never reached and would never reach, and painted an animal with a level of technical skill that still challenges trained artists today to reproduce by hand. They did this not once, but across a span of time longer than the whole of written history several times over, in caves scattered across an enormous stretch of Ice Age Europe, using techniques, subjects and symbols consistent enough to suggest a shared tradition maintained deliberately, generation after generation, long after the people who first developed it were gone. Whatever else that tradition meant to the individual people who carried it forward, it required something that modern viewers, standing safely outside the cave with a headlamp and a marked map, can still recognize clearly across the gap of tens of thousands of years. A willingness to give up comfort, safety, and daylight itself in order to leave something behind in the one kind of place on the Ice Age landscape built to hold it, unchanged, for longer than any single human life could ever last. The bison painted on the ceiling at Altamira is still there. So is the horse at Chauvet, its shaded flank curving into the natural contour of the rock, exactly as its painter intended, more than 36,000 years ago. The flame that lit that painter's hand went out within an hour of being carried into the cave. The image it revealed has not gone out yet.